Hi, my name is Mundi Morgado. I direct the front-end practice for TandemSeven, and I live in Oakland. Are there any Bay Area people here?
Any Californians in the crowd?
All right, just me, yay. All right. I have to admit, I don't like standing up in front of people and talking, so if I seem a little bit weird and nervous, it's because, well, I am. But it's okay, though. I brought Nathan with me. He's my anxiety service animal, so everything's going to be okay. Nathan, introduce yourself.
I'm Nathan. One of my pastimes is making nervous people stand up in front of people and talk. Check that box for today. I'm a front-end architect at TandemSeven, so Mundi's my boss. Here's some links, so if you don't want to take notes feverishly, you can just follow along with the slides or make fun of us on Twitter or whatever. The GitHub repo's there. We'll also post this again at the end. This is a picture of our development team at TandemSeven. Some people have freakishly large heads that float in air. It's super cool.
That's not photoshopped.
Yeah, no Photoshop involved here. And I'm just poking through the bushes there since I work remotely. So we begin with this assumption. Why style guides, right? It's because we're not good at following directions as human beings, and we tend to break things when we go off on our own path. Who here has kids? Okay, who here has ever worked with Legos? Who here doesn't yet have their hand up? All right, so that's everybody. All right, so I don't know if your kids are like mine, but we follow the instructions when we buy a Lego set, and it stays that way for maybe a week tops, and then it gets pulled apart and turned into other things. And I think that's the way that we tend to be as developers, right? So we want to know how things work, so we can reverse engineer and then put our own spin on things. Yeah, we enjoy knowing the why of design. So here's kind of the overview of the high notes of what we're gonna hit today. So what is a style guide? Can be many things, but I'll let Mundi take it from here.
Sure. So style guide can be about design governance, and what that means is just keeping up with the project as it evolves, making sure that people aren't going off and designing stuff that isn't part of the project. Just so you know the current state of the project. Want to go to the next one? Next one. And yeah, no one-offs. We want to make sure that people aren't going off and designing stuff that isn't part of the established pattern library. Next one.
And I love this photo because I think of the first one-off as like the first board that went on top of the car. Like probably no big deal. A little awkward, but you could still get it done. And then the guy that follows after you is like, well, how did we do that last time? Oh, we did this one-off. Okay, so then you have this pile-on effect, right, where you keep repeating the sins of the past, and eventually it just becomes untenable.
But really the main goal for style guides at TandemSeven, we're a consulting company, and we design and build applications for our clients. And sometimes we only get to do the design. We don't get to do the build. And what we were seeing a lot is that, the client's expectations with the design we gave them didn't match the reality as it was executed. So to kind of illustrate this, you might imagine Brad Pitt, and really what you get is Michael Cera. And actually, I kind of like Michael Cera better, but anyway, I think you guys get the point. And so really what we want to do is, the purpose of the style guide is to make sure that, we give our clients or whoever is developing the UI every chance to succeed and to really, execute the design the way it was envisioned. So additionally, along with that, we'll bake into our style guides things like accessibility standards, browser requirements, which are really important. And we want to put those requirements up front, like in the beginning of the design, so that the design team is aware of what those constraints or possibilities are, and so that can get fed back into the design. We also put stuff like best practices into our style guides, because this is documentation that we hand over to clients, and we want to educate our clients as well. We say this stuff because if certain best practices go unsaid, people are going to get the wrong assumptions. So we talk about the fact that we don't want to try to stylize native form elements, stuff like that. We're not going to try to cut corner graphics just to get rounded corners on IE8, those sort of things. So we want our style guide not only to serve developers well, but our clients well, who maybe don't understand all these sorts of nuances.
So I have this marked on my calendar as an all-day event. January 12th, 2016, IE8 will no longer be supported by Microsoft. Not only that, but let's let that soak in, right? Not only that, but the current version of IE that runs on any given platform will be the only one supported for that platform. So if you're a version behind, you're going to be forced to be at the current one in order for Microsoft to care if you have bugs or whatever. So yes. Which will, with impunity, let us do things like browser requirements, which Basecamp has already decided to dump some versions of IE preemptively. But really, your style guide can contain anything. And I just searched for random image, like I forget what I said, for random Chuck Norris image on Google, and this is the best one I could find. So hopefully that doesn't put us in violation of our code of conduct.
Really the determining factor for us for style guides is anything that you think will make the design successful as executed is what can go in a style guide. So there's really no hard and set rule, at least for us.
So here's some examples of style guides. Who here has heard of Bootstrap? Who here likes Bootstrap? Okay, who here, okay. So Bootstrap is the most popular one, probably. Here's an example of what Bootstrap does. It actually does quite a bit. Therefore, use Bootstrap. Thanks for coming, guys. But seriously, we've had clients come to us and say, we want this bespoke web app written. It needs to be very specific, do these things, and let's use Bootstrap as our starting point. And it's very difficult to try to explain, like, there's no undo in CSS, there's just add more pile on, right? So we keep stacking things on top of the Volkswagen when it's not designed to be a shipping vehicle. So Mundi and I have talked extensively about that. Like, why are we having to fight this, like, don't use a prefab thing when what you want is bespoke? But I think it's because, the clients will have developers that they're familiar with one thing, and they solutioneer and they try to apply that round peg to square hole scenario to a lot of different things. And so I'm like, I feel like this is us, number one, and then, like, this is the other guys that we're trying to, like, deal with when we're trying to work collaboratively with a lot of companies. Which is not to say that using a third-party framework is bad, and I won't read this to you verbatim, but the one I wanted to highlight here is that the more invested you are in your kitchen sink framework, the harder it is to change and adapt over time if that's what you've saddled yourself with. So one size does not fit all, and you should never, ever use absolutes. So here's some examples of some, what we consider style guide / frameworks. Foundation is another good one. Salesforce just launched their Lightning design system, which is pretty cool. Definitely go check that out. If somebody held a gun to my head and said, you have to use an existing thing, I'd probably use this one. Material, Google has a lot of good documentation on kind of the how of to design for Android and whatnot, not necessarily the code snippets. US government now has a style guide, which is pretty cool. Patternlab.io is an interesting approach to thinking about how things go together. So you have like atoms, molecules, organisms, and that kind of rolls up and composes into pages. Patternpack.org, and I'm going to shoot him with a laser pointer here. Marcelo, he made this. Go check that out, patternpack.org. That's another approach to doing style guides. I used to use Middleman, which is like the view layer of Rails to build things, build static style guides. Or you could make your own style guide, which is what we're talking about today.
And maybe you may be confused, that we're showing Bootstrap and Foundation and saying that that's a style guide. But really, I think modern style guides have evolved from traditional brand standards and then things like Bootstrap, which package the documentation in a really nice way. And the combination of the why and the how are what you see in the modern style guides. So, but I think a lot of that owes credit to Bootstrap for being the first to really do a nice job of packaging design documentation that way. But yeah, so why did we decide to build our own? And why do we think that maybe you want to consider building your own? I think the main thing is that no two applications are the same, and so it's really hard to make an abstracted style guide framework that's just going to magically work with every single application. Plus, you get to learn a lot along the way, and you definitely have some blood, sweat, and tears. Actually, I just like listening to that album, but when I code, it's really nice. So yeah, and the one thing I wouldn't recommend is deciding to overhaul your entire style guide frameworks 3 weeks before you have to present on it at a conference, like we did.
So yeah, late September, I was like, hey, I'm getting kind of nervous. We don't have any slides yet. Let's start working on that. And he's like, let's rewrite the whole style guide framework. And I'm like, so I went from like a little nervous to like full-on panic attack. But I didn't let Mundi know that. I was like, oh yeah, definitely, we can hit that deadline for sure. Right. So then this was me October 1st, like taking what we had in the existing style guide, flipping the table. Here's our requirements.
Yeah, so like I said before, we're a consulting company, and a lot of times we have to hand off deliverables to our clients. So for us, it's really important that whatever we generate is portable. So we want to be able to statically generate the style guide. We can't have a requirement that it has to run on PHP or that it needs to be hooked up to a database. In fact, if you can even just click on it and run it off the file system, the better, because we never know what kind of client environment we're going to be getting into. So statically generated is definitely a must for us. The other big thing is it has to stay fresh. If you set out to build a style guide and it's not connected to your actual application, then it's just like any other piece of documentation. It gets instantly stale. So to the extent that you can have your style guide be generated out of an actual application code base ensures that it will always stay up to date as you're developing. Also for us, we have to include the brand standards, so a little bit of the why. And then, we want to include one example of one unique piece of every part of the design. And so those become your Lego pieces from which you can build any page that you want. And we want to create live working examples. And we also want to expose the markup so that developers who are implementing can just copy and paste or use the CSS. Because, I'll say it again, when you're handing off in a consulting or a client environment, when you're handing off design to other people, you don't know who's implementing that. And all too often, if it's an offshore company or if it's a big bank, their development firms don't have, huge front-end talent, and it's really hard to pull off web design these days, especially responsive design, stuff that goes across browser. So, taking the extra effort to code out those examples, have them be live, have them be copy-pastable really helps out. You want to do this?
So these are the commonalities between the style guide that we had circa September of this year and what we have now. Lodash glob lets you, get different chunks of files and directories off the file system. FS Extra has some niceties that the default Node FS doesn't. And then Phantom is what we still use for screenshots. And then here's everything that changed. We used handlebars before, now we're using React. We used JS hint before, now we're using standard. We used Sass or just flat file, depending on the project. CSS before, now we're using CSS modules with post CSS. We used highlight syntax coloring, which I found doesn't work too well for ECMAScript 6, so we're using Prism. We had things in YAML before, but we would end up fighting with indentation. And we're like, we're developers, why don't we just make this JSON? So we did. We're using Express, now we're using Webpack, a bunch of other things. And most notably, we're using NPM for our task automation, which is pretty cool.
Can you go back to that one? And really what this is Nathan replacing all my terrible, terrible code with all his really good code right there. So that's the V2. Okay. So we decided to build our style guide on Node. Node is great just because I don't know if some people are front-end developers, designers, or back-end developers, but I've always been a front-end developer. I don't have a computer science background, but I knew how to do JavaScript, over the years, starting with jQuery and then getting more advanced. And if you haven't played with Node, I would highly recommend it. It's great. It's approachable. You don't have to be a programming superstar. I'm definitely not. But if you know JavaScript, you know Node. And then once you understand like how to import modules, how to access the file system with Node, you get this whole new superpower, and it's really kind of addictive. But yeah, so we use Node and we love npm. How many people use like a task runner like Grunt or Gulp? Cool. How many people have stopped using Grunt or Gulp and just use npm for your build system? Oh, cool. A couple people. So we're not saying that this is the way to go, but in my mind, the less moving parts you can have in your application, the better. And everyone's been through this with a Grunt file or a Gulp file. It kind of balloons, and now you have Grunt plugins that use Browserify underneath and something here and there. But for something like a style guide that maybe is not as complex as an application, you can use the script section of npm and to directly call those tasks, and you can call them in order or parallel, and it just removes one thing. So it's not that Grunt or Gulp are bad, but for us, being able to use the script section of npm and execute our tasks like that keeps things simple, and it just removes one layer of complexity. So an example of that, this is the package.json that will be in every Node project. And there's a script section. And so what that means is if you type into the command line start, you can type npm run start. npm will execute whatever script is hooked up in the package.json. What's also nice that not a lot of people know is that if you define a script called start and you say npm run start, npm will automatically look for something called pre-start if you have it defined, and will run that. And also it'll run post-start. So it's kind of convenient when you're trying to hook a bunch of different scripts together and you don't want to write and repeat a whole bunch of commands in one thing. And same thing for build. We use Webpack to generate our build, but before we publish our build, we want to blow away the previous build. So that's why we hook into pre-build. That will first run the test, make sure everything's okay, and then once everything's cool, blow away the build folder, and then that'll get to build and call Webpack, which will start running. So yeah, some gotchas in our experience using npm this way. It can get a little hairy. If you have really complex, highly involved set of build automation that you need to do, it gets a little cumbersome trying to jam all that stuff in a script section. So in that case, maybe offloading to Grunt or Gulp may be a better approach. Cross-platform portability. So what's nice about scripts, right, is you can attach an npm script to any sort of command line instruction, but if you're working on Windows only, you have to make sure, or on Mac only, you have to make sure that whatever those instructions are work on Windows. And so we ran into that with remove rm-r. But there's usually workarounds for that. There's a ton of modules on npm, and so we found one from Cinderhorse, I think is his name, and he's a prolific module author. And he built one that abstracts that command into a cross-platform instruction. So now we can just say clean, trash, build. Right, so I think we got all those. Even if you are using Grunt and Gulp, it's still nice to map the script section of your package.json to whatever you have in your Grunt or Gulp build. That way, anybody coming into your project can just pull up package.json and see not only the dependencies that your project has, but also what sort of things you can do with the build.
So when Facebook first announced React, I forget what conference it was at, but I dug this back up. And what day was that? 29th of May, 2013. I was like, did anybody else raise your hand if you just threw up in your mouth when you saw Facebook put HTML and JavaScript? And everybody else was like, yeah, this is terrible. And I think Ben Allman said, React, rethinking best practices. We've already got that solved, guys. And then the next talk from the React team was rethinking best practices, why it's not solved yet. So I will admit, React is pretty awesome. I was basically super wrong. Over the years, there's been a short list of things I've gotten really excited about doing web development. One was when I realized CMSs were a thing, like, oh my gosh, no more FTP and all this crap. Second was jQuery, like, oh my gosh, no more typing all this crap. Sass, same thing. And with React, it just feels like a totally different way of thinking about, it is indeed rethinking best practices, but I think in a kind of fun, exciting, and scalable way. So ECMAScript 6 itself is weird in a familiar way. It's like, you know, Doc coming to Marty from Back to the Future, and it's Doc, but he's in a hover car, and like, what's going on? It's from the future. So the way that we are using React is with ES6 classes, which gets transpiled back to what can run in the browser today via Babel. JSX, which is the throw up in your mouth HTML and CSS that's actually not throw up in your mouth worthy standard for our linter. One of the things that's a big point of contention about standard, even amongst our team, is that it disallows semicolons. So if you type a semicolon, it tells you that's against the standards. But don't shoot the messenger. Otherwise, it has generally agreeable conventions, and the nice thing is you're not having to config a JS hint or a JS lint file per project. You just install standard, and it'll bark at you if you aren't keeping things consistent. ES6 and JSX feel weird enough and different enough that what's one more thing, leaving off semicolons. So it feels totally weird for about the first week or so. Here's an example of a ES6 file. And again, this is all on GitHub, so don't feel like you have to like mentally parse all that. But you know, you have your constructor, your super. Instead of saying function, whatever, if it's within the class, you just give it the name, default state. So this isn't being called; that's being defined. This is a great article. This kind of helped me get over my phobia. JSX looks like an abomination, but it's good for you. Definitely check that out. And again, in the slides, you can read the URL up here and check that out. Here's an example of JSX. So it looks basically like HTML. You can drop into JavaScript and map different things, different functions to different aspects of the data you're passing around. We're also using React on the server, which I've heard is called isomorphic, but then I've heard we're supposed to call universal now. And I just think of it as being like the cool kids, because we're doing JavaScript everywhere. So what we do is we create a JSX layout component. So in our project, we actually don't have an index.html file. That gets built by React. Then using Node, we have Webpack require that will resolve all the dependencies. It will run the ES6, turn it into ES5 if it needs to. And then using React DOM server, which is something that Facebook provides in the React library, we say render to static markup that returns the HTML, and then we save it. So here's a just very stripped down file that you would use to take a template in and render it out as static index.html. The one tricky part is that this comment isn't valid and isn't valid JSX syntax, so we just take the result of our HTML and then manually concatenate a string at the beginning. So it's kind of get her done, you know.
I just want to speak to a gotcha here. You know, we like using React, we like using Webpack, and what's really nice about Webpack is it's a module loader, right? So we can include CSS directly in our JavaScript component. The problem is that when you're running server-side and you're trying to render server-side, if you just require in a React component in Node, plain Node, and that component is trying to itself include a CSS file, it's going to barf. And so that's what that Webpack require module is. It's a really neat module that instead of doing a Node require, you do a Webpack require in it to your React component, and it will resolve all of the dependencies based on the Webpack config that you pass in there. So that was a way to get around rendering these components on the server side from Node when Node doesn't understand how to load in CSS or whatever other static asset that you have. The only complaint we have is that typically we're doing this in a loop, so we're looping through the file system, reading all the components, and then pulling that in, and that can get a little slow because it's basically starting up Webpack 20 different times and doing that path resolution. So we're looking for ways to make that a little better. Okay, I'll keep going. So PhantomJS, we use that to create screenshots. So what's nice in a style guide is if you can have essentially a sitemap that shows pictures of what all the screens look like. And in this responsive world, you don't want to just see one picture of how it looks like on a desktop, but maybe you want to see it on 3 different breakpoints side by side. So we use PhantomJS to automate this. And it's the same sort of deal. You'll see in our style guide, pretty much the pattern for everything is glob a bunch of stuff in a directory, loop through, and then do something. And so same deal with Phantom. We scan, and in fact, in this case, we just have a list of the screens. We loop through the screens, pass it to Phantom. It renders the page, and then with the Phantom script, we're able to change the resolution of the screen and then take another screenshot. Like with everything, when you choose to kind of roll your own, you're going to hit all sorts of crazy edge cases. So one of the gotchas we ran into, at first, in fact, in our original version of our style guides, we were using the PageRes library, also by Sindre. And it's fantastic. In fact, if we had our way, we would just use that and not roll our own Phantom script. The problem is that that includes Phantom 1.9 or whatever. And unfortunately, that includes Phantom 1.9 runs a super old version of Chrome. And so our CSS wasn't looking so good, and we would even have some JavaScript errors because it couldn't understand the way Webpack was concatenating files. So that led us to use Phantom 2. The problem with that is it's a little bit difficult to install via NPM. There is a PhantomJS 2 package out there, and we tried it, but it kept bombing out on us. So ultimately, we just had to download the binary and use it directly. But you know, when you're trying to automate stuff and distribute it to a bunch of developers, that can be tough because now everybody has to do the same. It's a manual step, and if you don't understand how to put Phantom in your path or that sort of stuff, you know, everyone's going to have issues with it. So that's a little bit of a pain point right now, but hopefully that will evolve. It looks like the progress on Phantom has kind of slowed, or the activity around it, but hopefully it'll keep evolving, and we'll be able to update PageRes with Phantom 2 and use a modern version of Chrome. Alternatives too, there's a project called Slimer.js, which is essentially the Gecko Firefox version or equivalent of Phantom. And a lot of the API is compatible, so you may have some success with that as well. And it's also good just to be able to render screenshots with different rendering engines. So that's, you know, the more the better. You want to talk about this?
So I put this as a pro tip, but really it's more like the CSS I was writing upset Phantom. So we have, since Phantom basically just is a instance of a browser, just like with Chrome DevTools, you can edit the page live. With Phantom, you can pass scripts to get run in and edited live. So one thing that I do is I make it add to the HTML tag data mode Phantom. And there's nothing magic about that. This could be peanut butter equals jelly. I just needed a CSS hook to exclude some fancy like sticky footer stuff I was doing. So that will actually let you in the command line, or sorry, in the Chrome DevTools, you can add that, or you can hard code that in your HTML as you're wanting to make sure that your layout is doing what Phantom's going to like. So here's in my script that Phantom runs, I just set data mode Phantom, and then in my CSS I say, hey, HTML tag that's not data mode Phantom, do this, and then descendants off of that. All right, so let's dig into the demo here. Do you want to narrate and I'll drive?
So I will say this, we started this 3 weeks ago, so it's just a start. And we look forward to cleaning up the code base, making it more modular, making it more extensible, adding in, of course, more features. Really, ultimately, what we're trying to do is recreate the Salesforce Lightning design system, because personally, I think that's the best example of a style guide out there. So we're always looking to that. And if we can get halfway there with this, we'll be really happy.
So in terms of being an actual client-side app, we have a 2-page app. It's a single-page app, but with 2 routes. We're using the React router, which lets you this could be indented, but I just have it kind of flush left. But if you hit the index route, it goes to the accounts component. If you hit the profile route, it goes to the profile component. So let me show you here. Chrome is floating around somewhere here. Okay. So zoom out a little bit. So this is our index route, and the React router adds a little key to kind of track uniqueness of state. So that's what that is there. But then we can toggle back and forth between the two routes. Have example components that have been assembled into pages here. It's responsive, yay. And then the style guide is actually a separate folder. So the app could run by itself, and then the style guide is kind of like an exoskeleton that snaps onto the app and then consumes what's inside the app.
So basically what we showed you was we showed you the app first, and the app is comprised of a whole bunch of pieces, and now we're going to show you the style guide, which basically deconstructs what you just saw into its parts. So here's the intro. It's just some boilerplate stuff for somebody coming to the style guide for the first time. But really, let's go over to patterns section. Actually, no, I'm sorry, let's start with branding. So this is the part that we've kind of translated from traditional print-based style guides. These colors are coming from a config file. So essentially, we work, our design team will work with the client, understand what the color palette is, and then we take that and we put that into a config file. And then to generate the style guide, we'll load that config file in and we'll point it to our brand template, and that'll iterate through and print out all the pretty colors. What's interesting is that, in a sense, this is kind of documentation. Once you get that color palette, there's nothing to stop a developer from putting rogue colors in their CSS and going off the course. So one enhancement idea that we have, there's a great project from Alex Sexton called Color Guard, and what it can do is you can pass it your CSS file and it can analyze the colors that it has, and you can compare it to the set of approved colors you have, and it will alert you when you're going off track. So we think that's a really neat approach and something that we want to build in. Because right now this is largely static and config driven, but in the future what I would love to do is, using post CSS, you can pull in a CSS file that it can give you that abstract tree representation, and then you can parse it yourself, and you can actually see what's really in your CSS, what colors, what fonts, and put those on the page. So maybe some combination of the two, what's approved and what's reality, and then that way you can make sure that you stay on track. So we also show font tests for the typography of the different web fonts that we're using.
It's all Helvetica, I think, because our internet connection is off. So, but yay for fallbacks, right?
So let's go to the pattern section. This is really the meat of the style guide for us. And this is, once again, patterns you can think of as these are your Lego pieces. So this is one unique, this is one of everything that's in the design. And so these are live examples. When we generate the page, we have a components directory, and we iterate through that components directory, and we pull out each template. We render it server-side, and then we generate this page. And then with React, we're able to, you can do it one of two ways. You can rehydrate the static markup, or you can have like real live targeted examples. Along with the live example, we want to present the generated HTML so that you can get a sense of the structure of the markup. And then while we're at it, we also expose the JSX, the underlying JSX. What's interesting from our previous style guides, when they were driven with a lot of our previous applications we built with Backbone and handlebars, and you had this real clear separation of HTML from JavaScript. With React, it's a little bit weird because JSX puts both of them together. So it's not like in our previous style guides when we could say, here's the exact HTML markup before it's rendered. So it would be nice maybe if we had a way to extract just the JSX markup, HTML markup, but for now we're just showing both the JSX and the HTML.
Just shown if you don't define a callback, the button will it'll send back the event and a string of whatever the button data might have been, and that only runs if you're if you're on localhost. So we have like our own logger that is silent when you're in production mode. Oops. So let me see. Pretty proud of our tabs, because to me it always felt weird trying to maintain an unordered list that then you remember to make that href point to that ID of the thing or whatever. So our approach to tabs is that you would actually just have a tab panel inside a tabs area, and then that would get chewed through, looped through React, and then it would spit out the typical UL, LI markup. Also, I'm pretty big on making sure all the React components that we make have the correct ARIA roles. So if you go on GitHub and check out our components that we built, you'll see that sometimes if there's no ID attached, it'll create an ID, and that's for uniqueness, so that a label will associate correctly to its checkbox, things like that. Or that table pagination will be related to its table if the user doesn't supply an ID.
One neat thing about using React to build your components, because we had this problem in our previous style guide when we were using Backbone and handlebars, is that when you want to print out a list of templates, when you create a handlebars template, there's not metadata. Like if you have a button, but you want to pass in what's the label of the button, there's no way to automate that. So we ended up having to have YAML files, basically example configs that we would pass for the purpose of the style guide to make the button print what we wanted to print, or to config our component in some meaningful example. What's nice about React is that it has a concept of props. And so you can pass it, what's nice about props is basically you can validate against them. So if you have a component and you're not passing it some data that it needs to do its thing, it'll warn. But you can also pass in default properties. So default properties becomes a really nice way to embed in the actual component itself the sample data that you need to render just something as an example. And that way, we got out of the trap of having to main two separate files, one example metadata file to pass to our template. Now they can be kind of one and the same, which is nice.
Yes, that's really cool, because then our style guide framework, with the components having default props, it doesn't have to know I'm being used in demo mode or I'm being used in production mode. If you were going to use it in production mode, you would pass data to it. The absence of that puts it into demo mode, so that way you can just have a simple loop. You want to talk about the next? Okay. Go Chrome. Switch to Chrome. There we go. Also, we have requirements where we document what browsers we're going to support. I was kind of purposely vague here because this is what I would consider to be boilerplate then we would get more specific per project or whatever. We do have some clients come to us, even recently, and said, we only use IE9. We need an app that only works in IE9. And I'm like, I'd rather it work in IE9 and work in everything else, but if you only use it in IE9 and you're none the wiser that I secretly made it work in Firefox, then, but so this is where we would document that type of stuff. CSS3, native form controls, we're not going to recreate a radio button that the browser gives us for free. Accessibility, the emphasis here is on keeping things accessible, not making things accessible. Accessibility isn't a thing you add later, it's inherent unless you take it away. And then, just kind of a little bit of blurb about our build and delivery process. Let me show the markdown thing real quick.
So, when you're building a style guide, you're going to have not only live examples, but you're going to have content. And so, since we're generating this statically with Node, we're able, and we want, one of the goals of the style guide is that you don't have to be a super developer or technical to edit stuff. So if somebody wants to go in and edit content, text-based content in the style guide, we try to extract those text contents out into markdown format and then pull them in as part of the build process. So that way, somebody who wants to update some copy that's in the style guide can just open up one of these files and just start editing.
So that way we can have design coworkers write design documentation. And one thing that's really cool is that because this is in GitHub, we just have our design coworker have a GitHub account, and he or she can log in, and if they want to, they can actually just click edit in the repo and live edit in the browser and not have to clone down the project. They can commit their saves to the markdown file directly And because GitHub has Markdown preview, they can see, oh, is that a link or did I mess up the syntax or whatever. That makes it super easy to have contributors that don't necessarily need to get the repo or that would be intimidated if they had to dig through to find in the JSX where they need to type raw content or whatever. And oh, this is, do you want to talk about, okay, so this is crazy. Yeah, sure. So because Phantom is just a browser and the browser has dev tools and you can run scripts inside of it, what I'm doing is I'm inserting a div into the page and I'm asking the page, how tall are you, page? And then I insert that in there. Then I tell Phantom, go screenshot this. And so we can actually make the screenshot self-documenting. We were geeking out this morning. We were like, oh, we could put timestamps in there. We could put like watermarks. Like anything you can do in a page, you can do with Phantom. So we've actually, we're making sure to put the size of the screenshot so the client isn't wondering which screenshot that is.
Because one thing what's nice about, if you look at the Salesforce Lightning design system, in their components they actually have like status, like if a component is ready or yet, or what, if it's in dev mode or if it's ready for production. And so as we're doing these screenshots, we can also take that metadata and blast it onto the screen and then take a screenshot of it. So that's baked into the image. So that way, if you're looking at an application and you're like, why does this component not look okay, you can refer back to the style guide and you can see the last known good version. And in this screenshot itself, you can see what, the timestamp or whatever information you would need to make sure.
So here I'm trying to play nicely in that if somebody in the app or somebody that's working on the app, not working on the style guide framework, wanted to style the screenshots area, they could. Because first all I do is I check for the existence of it. If it doesn't exist, then I create it and I assign the style object that I've been building up here to that, so it has a black background, white text. If not, all I do is set it to display block. So they can set it to display none in their CSS. When Phantom goes and finds the page, it'll look for this ID. It'll create it if it doesn't exist, or if it does, it'll force it to display with whatever CSS the designer has specified. And then it'll write the inner HTML. And then it will, oh, actually I need to exclude the insertion if it's already there. But and then it'll return the height to Phantom itself, which is being looped through take screenshots here. Or take screens. So that here it's getting the true height of the page. So yeah, that's kind of what we had for you guys. Do you have any questions? We wanted to kind of get to the end, let people ask questions and answer if we can. In the back there? Yeah. What made us decide to do the server-side route with React? Yeah.
Yeah, so in our example application, we're actually doing client-side rendering, but for the style guide itself, when you generate a style guide, you have to have access to the file system of the application in order to know what all the components are, and so that you can only do server-side. And since our requirements for our style guide is it has to be flat, it has to be able to be served from a static file server. That's the only way you can do it, basically, is that you have to have a build process to generate it ahead of time. And so that dictated the fact that we have to build out that component during the build process, which is essentially server-side. And so that's why the render to static markup method of React DOM server is really handy for that. If we had like a real-time style guide server, and you could get a request for a certain component, and then it could do all those operations real-time, but we have to keep it flat and static for portability, and so that we can hand it off to different clients.
I can show the build, how it will build statically real quick. So I couldn't get the projector to cooperate, so I made it not mirrored, so I'm reading right off the projection screen here. But okay, so we're in master. We can call npm run, and we're not going to attend this meeting right now, so close that. Npm run build, And actually, let me open up Finder real quick. And here we'll browse, not music. Sorry. Porch. All right, so we're gonna take all of build and destroy this here. Then we're gonna go back to iterm. We're gonna run build. And we will see that populate. Build is what creates the app. So please include the following.
Live coding, I told you.
What do we do?
One thing I want to call out actually is, if you choose this route to statically generate stuff with Node, you're going to run into right away is a pathing problems, because if you have a Webpack and you're running just a local server and your file paths are relative to the root of that server, but then when you statically generate a bunch of code that's supposed to work, you don't know where that code is going to live. It could be hosted in a static file server deeply nested in another directory, and then all the paths are off. So, when you're generating code to a flat file, and that file could be arranged anywhere in the directory structure, that is going to be a challenge. So, I feel that we're still learning how to deal with that in Node path resolution, especially when you're publishing stuff to all sorts of different places, and how to keep track, how to make sure that documents, assets are relative to wherever those assets may be in a bunch of different environments. It's a little bit of a challenge. Another huge module that helped us, a module that helped us hugely was, when you start using Node for the first time, you're going to want to do things with the file system. And so Node provides the FS package that you can require. It's built in, but it's good for basic stuff if you just want to read contents of a file. But as soon as you want to do something, like let's say I want to read a file, I want to create it, and I want to push it to a directory that maybe doesn't exist yet. Or maybe I want to push it to a directory that's nested in, but none of those exist. If you were just to use plain Node file system, you'd have to iterate, and you have to if a directory doesn't exist, you have to create it, and then you have to look in there, and if that doesn't exist, then you have to create it. And doing that yourself is really hard. So there's a package called fs-extra. I think from JP Richardson is his name. And so you can just say, I want to save this file to this path, and you can have a bunch of slashes and dots and whatever, and it'll just go ahead and make it. So we highly recommend that module as a really good helper utility when you're dealing with the file system, especially for nested files and that sort of stuff.
Let's pretend that did build and I hadn't fat-fingered the package.json. One sec. Yeah, so I'm going to go to where I know we have a good flat file export. So now there's no Node server running, so there's no sleight of hand here. But I'm going to say built into every Unix environment usually is just Python simple server, which is what Aomin will use. So now if this works, if we've successfully outputted flat file everything, I don't know why the monitors are not behaving, but I can't. There we go. Okay, so I should be able to go to 0.0.0:8000. And then I can see our app running. So that's the reason we wanted to do React server-side, is that we could pass around these flat files, and the client could take it and just drop it on any Apache server, wherever, IIS, and it's all just flat file. There's nothing specific. There's no ASP or Java or anything on the back end. And it can run wherever they want to deploy it to. Whereas if we'd done something like Angular, Angular has to have a DOM that gets parsed by JavaScript first. And so that is a lot more difficult to export to flat file without using something like Phantom to parse the DOM and then save that out as a result. So that's one cool thing, is that the React team thought through all that and has the ability to generate flat file out of the box. So then you can click around, and here it's not even running. Webpack is not being run, Node's not being run, nothing's live compiling, it's just all flat file here. So yeah, that's it. Unless more questions, I think we're good. Not trying to rush through it, but we seem to be at the end of our End of the internet. All right, thanks.